Okay, it's rolling.
Don't look at the camera, do look at you.
You look at me.
Okay.
So Natalia, I'd like to thank you for joining us today
Yeah.
to talk about your experience growing up in a bilingual home. So to kind of start off our interview, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your home life.
Yeah.
So what was it like to grow up in a bilingual home?
So backstory. My parents immigrated into the United States when they were probably about 23. We lived in New York for the first 6 years of my life, and that part of my life is probably a little fuzzier now that I'm older. But we moved to South Carolina when I was about 6 years old. But I think living in New York, where it's more culturally diverse, and living in South Carolina, I have to make the distinction because I think the two experiences were very different. I do remember a lot of my childhood life in New York. My parents had a lot more Hispanic friends, and we had a lot of get-togethers, and I remember almost being more vivid and more lively, like birthday parties and everything were definitely different from what I guess a traditional, normal American household would be. And when we moved to South Carolina, it was a little bit different. So my parents moved here, and we had a good set of friends, which were actually the ones that brought us over to South Carolina. But the parties weren't as big and as loud. I mean, we still had get-togethers and stuff. I mean, the traditions are very different. My parents will kill me for saying this, but we've come a long way. But there's obviously always the cultural difference. So for my sister's first birthday party, I wasn't born for this, but this is just it just shows a cultural difference. So for my sister's first birthday party, my parents decided to go to McDonald's and wanted to use the playpen in McDonald's. So they took over pots of soup and food and everything to McDonald's, to be able to use a playpen. And then they said, we didn't think there was anything wrong with it at the time. They're like, we look at it now, we've come such a long way, we're so embarrassed by it. So they would kill me for saying that. But so obviously there's cultural differences. And I think growing up in that household, when I was younger, I definitely didn't appreciate it as much as I did. I definitely felt like I stood out more and kind of it was a more negative thing. But I'm always thankful that my parents were so good about keeping the strong Latin roots in me no matter what, even if I fought them to it, because now as I'm older, I appreciate that I have that diversity.
That's great. And so which language is more dominant at home? Do you speak Spanish fully at home?
So my sister, same situation I did, she was born in New York as well. So my sister and I are more comfortable speaking English to each other. But my parents, I'm way more comfortable speaking Spanish to them. It feels very awkward, and they have very strong accents, but I think it just feels very awkward because when I was growing up, my parents were always very adamant about us speaking Spanish at the dinner table. If my parents had a rule that if we would ever start speaking English at the dinner table, they would stop speaking. And that was just because they wanted me and my sister to really grasp Spanish, because we were speaking English solely at school, and so they wanted to make sure that we grew up bilingual, and so they wanted the home life to be purely Spanish.
So do you consider yourself bicultural in addition to bilingual? Do you consider yourself more of an American, first identifying with your Hispanic heritage?
Yeah, I definitely do feel that I am bicultural. I think in two different settings, it's different. When I'm at school, I think I definitely adapted more to the American culture. Growing up here, and I don't have as many Hispanic friends here, and that's just because of the area where I am. I think a lot of my family that lives in New York has more ethnically diverse friends, and so I think they're probably more bicultural than I am. But then when I go home, I definitely don't feel American at all. My home is very Latino, and we definitely stay very strong to our cultures and our beliefs. We, for example, in Hispanic culture, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving. But because we are here, we do celebrate Thanksgiving. We have some of the traditions. But then stuff like Christmas, we have a big tradition of celebrating Christmas on Christmas Eve and do a big Christmas Eve party versus making Christmas Day a big thing. Christmas Day is more of a relaxed time, but Christmas Eve is a huge party with food, drinks, and gifts and games and the whole 9 yards. So I definitely think that at my home life I am more bicultural, but at school I think I have adapted more to the American lifestyle.
So what was it like transitioning from Spanish at home to English at school? Was that hard for you growing up?
I don't remember ever actually having difficulty with transitioning. So my parents never put me in ESL, which is English as a second language. My older sister went through ESL, but my parents decided not to put me in it because they felt that it hindered her more and kind of pushed her back in her academics. And I'm really thankful for them doing that because I actually, when I was in first grade, I guess I didn't really see an issue with it because when I was in first grade, I was put in a third grade class because my reading level was more advanced. So I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they did put me in ESL because my sister being in ESL, I think that did develop her a little bit differently too because a lot of people say that when my sister speaks English, she does have a little bit more of an accent, even though we grew up in the same household, everything, but she had that ESL background. And she lived in New York longer than I did too, so she had more Hispanic friends throughout her childhood, so I think that affected that more.
That's an interesting experience with ESL. That's something that we're looking into in our research project for sure.
Yeah.
So what kind of elementary school did you attend? And how did your classes kind of embrace your biculturalism?
So I attended, how many different elementary schools? 3.
Wow.
My first elementary school I attended was in New York. It was a public school, PS 41. It's pretty famous. So my parents took me out of that pretty quickly, just because it was a very unsafe environment, and they ended up moving me into a private school in New York as well, and finished my first grade year in that private school, and then that's primarily why my parents decided to move to South Carolina was because of the school system, and we had friends here who talked about the school system, and the private schools in New York, I compared them to the public schools here in South Carolina. The school system here is just 10 times better than it is there. So my school here, I guess I spent most of my elementary career here in Greenville, South Carolina, small elementary school, Simpsonville Elementary, and I did 2nd through 5th grade there. And I had one other friend who ended up, after my parents moved from New York, I had another close family friend who ended up moving from New York in my 4th grade year. But other than that, most of my friends were white. I was probably 1% of any ethnically diverse population in my elementary school. In my 2nd grade year, I didn't know this when I was younger. My parents came to tell me this way later, but as a child, they never wanted me to think about this experience. And when I was younger, I never really knew what was going on. So my 2nd grade teacher, I think, was a little bit more enclosed, and had just lived in South Carolina for her whole life, was raised here and everything. And I had a rougher 2nd grade year. Was always put in detention. It was always for talking too much. But a lot of the other peers just talked as much in my class, and so I felt like my teacher, would pick on me and stuff. But I in my head, I thought I was a bad kid, which I was a little bit of a rowdier kid. But my parents came to tell me later on that their first parent-teacher conference with her, to say the least, was not the most positive. So I had that experience, but I grew up not knowing that it was because of my race that she treated me differently. It was just simply because I thought I was a bad kid, because I felt different from all the other kids, obviously. I had 2 parents who, my parents both struggled with speaking English, and they still kind of do, and it's mostly, they've lived here a while, but it's mostly because they've always spoken Spanish to us, because they've always practiced Spanish with us, because they want to make sure that our Spanish is better than their English. Because we have a lot of family friends who do have children who don't speak Spanish, and their parents are completely fluent. So if my parents had decided to practice their English instead of teach us Spanish, we wouldn't have been bilingual. So there are those instances, but going back to elementary school, so sometimes, when I was younger, in elementary school, I didn't really see too much of a differentiate. I wasn't embarrassed of my culture just because I guess I wasn't I'm Hispanic. I think I started to see it more when I was in middle school. And that's about the age where I think there was more differentiation, and I was more aware of my surroundings and what people thought and everything. And so it was not until later in my educational career where I would reflect back and see, these experiences were because of this and this, like my 2nd grade teacher experience.
And so how did your race affect your ability to make friends in elementary school? You mentioned kind of didn't make a big difference until middle school, or, what was that like even in middle school when that difference was evident?
Yeah. I think for some people, and this is something I'm still trying to figure out now, even in college, for some people I have seen that they tend to, and it's the same thing with international students almost here at Furman, they just tend to feel more comfortable with people of their same culture. And I'm not quite sure if it's because I grew up in an elementary school where it's predominantly white, and because I was at that point in my age so young that I didn't really see the huge differentiation, that I was just comfortable being around mostly white friends and people who didn't speak another language, that I don't think ever hindered my ability to make friends or anything. And I mean, naturally I am more of an outgoing person anyways, but I mean, my sister, for example, my sister and I are both very different. She is a little bit shyer, and she had always tended to stay closer to a smaller group of Hispanic friends, and we both came from the same house. So I think it is a lot of the personality as well. And that could go back to being the fact she's an older sister. So I guess my parents always say, like, we kind of experimented on the eldest sibling, which a lot of families do. So it could be because she grew up in ESL. She lived longer in New York. So she had a more diverse childhood than I probably did.
That's interesting. The difference between the personalities and the assimilation into American culture.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And so I understand you are learning a third language, Chinese.
Yeah.
And so how did your bilingual background affect your desire and your ability to learn a third language?
So my desire to learn Chinese was more of my Furmanite desire of, I want to learn these little characters and see where it goes from there. But the ability to learn it, I definitely think, I mean, people say, learning another language now that you can speak two languages is a lot easier. So picking up your third language is a piece of cake. I mean, Chinese is a little bit different because it is, characters and then like the tones and everything. So it's a little bit more of a complex language, but I haven't found it too difficult. And I mean, but I never feel like it's because of Spanish or anything, because I know another language. I think I just have developed an interest in it. Now, I did take French in high school for 3 years. And knowing Spanish really helped a lot with that, because I mean, I would find myself whenever I was unprepared for a quiz or something, if I didn't know a word in French, if I could translate it into Spanish, I could just change it up a little bit and it was correct. So I think like Spanish, Italian, and French are all pretty similar. So knowing that, I mean, I was able to pick up French. And like I said, I only took French for 3 years, but the other day, one of my friends, Johnson, who's fluent in French, I heard him speaking French to somebody and knew exactly what he had said, and I was like, I haven't taken French in like 7 years, and I knew exactly what you're saying, or 4 years, because I'm not that old yet, but yeah, but I was like, I knew exactly what you're saying, which blew my mind because I just haven't studied French again, but I think it's also because it's so similar, it was just easier to pick up on. Yeah.
Well, Natalia, I want to thank you for your time.
Yeah.
I think all of our conversations will really benefit my research.
Good.
And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Great.
I love that we just interviewed for a camera. So cute. Those are good questions.